Thunderstruck by Merlos the Mad. Chapter 4 First Steps. Stephanie's face was set in stone, eyes moving from left to right, scanning the computer screen's displayed diagnostics with every ounce of her attention. "I don't get it." She exhaled a breath she'd been holding without realizing it, and fell back into the chair. Her arms flopped out to either side of the seat when she languished, staring at the useless monitor before her. Hal answered its owner despite not being addressed. "Is there something I can do to help you, Stephanie?" he drawled. Stephanie blinked, trying to work out the tiredness beginning to affect her and weighing down her eyelids. "No," she said absently, still staring at the computer screen. "I think I'm done for now, Hal. Thanks for your help. I'm going to power Sweetie down, then go to bed." She hadn't found any explanation despite her hours of searching. Hal's periphery studied its master carefully, taking note of things, but coming up with less else it could do. "Very well, Stephanie. I agree that you should sleep soon. You have been awake for approximately 22 hours as of now. If you change your mind, please ask if you require any other assistance from me with your current project." Stephanie saw the red orb blink out from the corner of her eye a moment after he finished speaking to her. She hesitated to look from the screen over to the subject of conversation, Sweetie Belle. Over in the center of the room was the shell of what used to be the adorable little robot. It sat there contentedly, watching her. Quietly, Stephanie finally glanced over. The machine re-began its never-ending staring contest with her, which it seemed all too happy to engage in at every opportunity. Other than slight movements of its head and eyes, the little filly had yet to move much at all. Stephanie furrowed her brow in thought. What is wrong with her? Her eyes studied the scalded little robot carefully, thinking if there were something obvious she had missed. Besides all the physical damage, there was surprisingly little sign of anything at all on the inside. The shielding and temperature control had performed well, it seemed, but a few small bits and bobs in Sweetie were fried by the fire itself. They were things that could be replaced with ease. Everything that could be looked over by her careful eye without completely disassembling Sweetie had been, leaving Stephanie at a loss for ideas. Nothing I've ever said to her verbally or through the computer registered at all. And what was with what she said hours ago? Sweetie had asked something. She asked me who I was. Is her vision damaged? No, she still wouldn't ask something. A glitch? Stephanie's finger tapped thoughtfully on the desk, considering the possibilities. It was almost as if the bot were a blank slate, judging by the diagnostics. Sweetie wasn't, though, obviously. In fact, all its data seemed intact, the hard drives still functioning and holding files, and no more corruption or disorder than normal. The conundrum must lay on a smaller scale, namely Sweetie's programming or software. The robot just stared at Steph contentedly, the smile growing or shrinking slightly when she looked at Sweetie. That was another oddity. Sweetie looked contented, happy, but for no reason. She stayed that way too, rather than resetting its expression for different prompts. Nothing a woman said seemed to get a different response, which looked a tad creepy, but mostly it just seemed random. Stephanie ran a hand over her mouth and pushed her lab chair back quickly, standing up and striding over to Sweetie in just 2 steps that were almost jumps. She was at the end of her patience. I want to call it a night, but it feels like I've wasted my time thus far. I want something out of this. Stephanie lifted the nearby remains of her bot's power cord, which had melted and bubbled from the incident. The ruined cord lay on the table, forgotten and destined for the garbage. A new one was now attached to the bot. Earlier, Stephanie had attached the replacement of the ruined cord quickly, just before Sweetie's power had run out once more. That at least had proven to be an easy fix for her. With Sweetie's power problem solved, she had been able to work on fixing things well into the night, which she had. Not that any of the hard work had paid off. Stephanie shook her head and dropped the cord back on the table. "Sweetie," she began, repeating the ancient method by which she had given her machine verbal commands over the years. "Offline." Unexpectedly, Sweetie just stared back at Stephanie, the mechanical eyes it used to see focused and panned slightly to observe its owner's face. Her eyes' lights still worked, but were off. Despite Stephanie trying to reactivate them, they were just decoration. But it was another thing the diagnostic was unable to answer for. Something had changed with Sweetie's systems, but nothing seemed to work, such as the voice command that had been given to the machine. "Sweetie Belle," Stephanie tried again in a desperate tone. "Offline." She mouthed the words as one might to a foreigner, trying desperately to convey meaning. Sweetie Belle's smile widened a bit, her mouth opening slightly, but that was all. Stephanie growled in frustration. It very much seemed to her as if Sweetie had forgotten the very meaning of the words themselves. "Did you forget how to talk or something?" Stephanie all but yelled. "There's nothing wrong with you, so why?" "Oh, there's nothing wrong with you, so why?" She spun around on one boot and shook her head, pacing around the table in a wide circle. Her eyes kept themselves trained angrily on the machine that defied her. Meanwhile, the little robot filly's head craned around to follow her, switching to look over its opposite shoulder when it couldn't follow Stephanie anymore, because she had moved too far in one direction. Stephanie stopped walking, taking notice of this. Curious, she went in the other direction behind Sweetie. The little robot repeated the prior action, switching its head's position by rotating back to the opposite shoulder. It seemed to want to stare more at the moving target of its intention. Curiously and mildly entertained, Stephanie took a single step back to the right, putting herself directly behind Sweetie. The damaged little thing attempted to turn its head the other way again, then back the way it had moved when it found that it didn't work. After just a moment, it seemed distressed that neither action worked, twitching slightly. In her exhausted state, Stephanie smirked, finding her troubled machine amusing. After a moment more, Sweetie stood up, very slowly, its back legs whirling noisily. This was the first sign of movement besides its head or eyes that Stephanie had seen. The robot stopped where it was standing, though, except for its head, still trying to rotate around. "Stephanie?" it called. Stephanie scrunched her face up, confused by the way her machine had said her name again, like it was unfamiliar with the pronunciation. The bot continued to turn its head side to side, trying to look at her. It sat again after half a minute, when it still couldn't see her by trying to turn its head twice more in another direction. It stood up a second time. The machine froze, and Steph began to think it had given up, just before she stepped around to its front again. It began emitting static from its speaker, loudly. The screech was sudden and bounced off every wall in the basement. Gah! Stephanie's hands flipped to her ears. Hal, kill her voice! The static ended. Stephanie let out a breath of relief, then angrily turned to face Hal. What was that? She turned back to the filly on the workbench. It had begun trying to look at her again. Hal answered dryly. Static. A crackling or hissing noise on a telephone, radio, or other telecommunication device. Would you like to know more? Ugh. Hal, never mind. Stephanie rubbed her temple while in thought, glaring at the metal pony. On the workbench, Sweetie did something else different. Its front legs raised up, then lowered again onto the same spot. Stephanie stared flatly at the new development. Huh, all right. Now what's she doing? She watched as Sweetie raised the same leg again, moved it slightly to the side this time. Hal replied slowly this time. The project seems to be randomly firing commands to its systems. Other than that, I can hardly say. Stephanie, it does not seem to be acting in accordance with the programs stored in its hosts in the host files. It ignores them. I recommend an immediate purge of the project systems and a full restore. Would you like to continue? Stephanie frowned at the table beneath Sweetie, then at her AI assistant attached to the wall. No, I would like to... The frown turned to a gasp as the bot pitched forward off the table. Hey, no! She dove forward in an attempt to grab the bot's back legs, just barely clearing the distance to snag them in time. Stephanie angrily addressed Hal again. I thought that's everything that was still intact. She's a complete mess. She dragged Sweetie Belle back onto the table and walked around it to inspect the front. It was still charred. It was still scarred and burned, but seemed no worse for wear from the fall. Steph glared at it. Is the problem in the host files that you have or something? A small smile appeared back on Sweetie's expression, staring back pleasantly but not answering. Hal answered without pause. It is not system files prevent in units designation Sweetie Belle match those stored in your computer, Stephanie, nor changes have detected in host files. Hal, there's something wrong with them, even if the files still match the backup files. Unless there's something seriously mechanically wrong that we missed. Stephanie frowned at the legs of her creation. They hadn't shown any damage after opening each one up for a quick inspection, but maybe there had been something. Hal, was Sweetie Belle trying to walk? The robotic assistant answered without pause again. Yes. Stephanie watched as Sweetie began to stand up once again, robotic eyes locked on her own. Is there some sort of block between her and her basic functions? This is some malfunction, all right, but what if... She was eager to see if an idea she had would play out. Walking quickly and eagerly, Stephanie paced around behind Sweetie again, where the woman watched and waited. On the bench, Sweetie began moving, but skipped, trying to turn her head. First she stood up, next her mouth opened, then closed. Stephanie looked at her assistant's camera fast enough to fling her tousled mop of brown hair. Hal, did she just try making that racket again? Yes, he answered. Stephanie looked back in time to see Sweetie Belle begin shifting her legs, one after the other, without lifting them. The movement resembled a shuffle. Slowly but surely the filly turned around, the metal soles of her hooves scraping slightly on the table, then sat again, now facing Steph. Sweetie looked up from watching her own legs to Steph, once finished with the painstakingly slow movement, and her smile grew more. Amused, Stephanie let out a fit of giggling. Oh dear, I am way too tired for this. She put a hand on her head, watching her old pet project with a hysteric sort of glee in her eye. Ugh. She pressed the hand over her face and winced. She felt beyond exhausted now. Without thinking, she commanded Sweetie in a bid to go to bed. Sweetie, offline. Stephanie, Hal spoke up. This has proven ineffective. Stephanie threw her arms up angrily. I know! Never mind! She let out with an annoyed breath and crouched in front of Sweetie, close enough to see the inner workings of the machine's eyes. Now I need to go to sleep, Hugh, as fascinating as this is or not. So I guess I'll have to turn you off the old-fashioned way, Stephanie placed a hand inside the still open side compartment. In the morning, or afternoon, I guess. A short laugh escaped Steph, watching Sweetie's smile stare as she spoke to her. I'll take you apart again, and then we can see what's wrong with you. Hopefully it's fixable. How does that sound? Sweetie Belle blinked again, but otherwise didn't move right away, and certainly didn't answer the question. But before Steph made to deactivate the robot, it began moving its mouth up and down. She paused, watching the oddity, and listened to the soft sounds of her machine's gizmos working. The volume was muted, but regardless of that, it usually didn't move its mouth to speak. Whitney squinted her eyes. What is it doing? After Sweetie moved its jaw in what was likely every possible way it could, it stopped and straightened slightly. In response, Stephanie sighed and leaned on one hip, waiting to see if it would do more. When it didn't, she shut her eyes and shook her head. Well, all right, time for bed, kiddo. Her hand raised and clicked the switch to power it down. Sweetie Belle turned its head to watch her arm, then looked back at Stephanie's face. When it didn't power down, that raised some eyebrows. Stephanie let out a frustrated groan. A groan of frustration. Ugh. You're kidding me! Everything was supposed to be fine! She strode back to the computer and tried studying the monitor again. I just checked the hardware. This is... Holy crow! I'm too tired for this. The sound of the machine standing and turning around again clacked in the background. This is hopeless. Steph couldn't focus on the screen, and she knew that none of the data would be any different. Well, I guess that settles it. She straightened up, then walked up to Sweetie. The program's so borked. I can't tell if... Oh, the program's so broken, I can't tell that it's broken. Her expression lit up with a load-side crazed smile. Sweetie Belle seemed all too eager to return the smirk to its owner, lowering one side of its expression a little. It took Stephanie a moment to realize what the machine had done. Did you just copy me? She tilted her head out of pure incredulity. Perhaps it's taking input visually rather than audio somehow. Surprising the woman again, Sweetie Belle tilted her head to the side, back at her. Steph's eyes widened a fraction at that. She paused a moment and ran a hand down Sweetie's head, feeling the singed remains of her mane. You are copying me, but why? Sweetie blinked in response. Steph put her hand to her chin, more ideas circling an explanation for what was going on, or what was making Sweetie act so differently. She knew the robotic creation was little more than an interactive talking pet, one she'd tinkered with in years rather than adding additional soundtracks for her to play on command. Stephanie shrugged, knowing she would have to look deeper to know anything for sure. Don't worry, you'll get fixed tomorrow, sweetie. After a pause and tilting her head, she added, In fact, this is as good as an excuse to make you better than ever, huh? We'll take you apart, look at everything close up. Her finger bopped Sweetie on the nose. Rather than the usual giggle or laugh that was programmed as a response for nose bopping, one of the first things Stephanie had programmed for Sweetie because it was adorable, the robot instead crossed its eyes and began staring at its nose blankly. After inspecting it for a moment, it looked back up at its owner. Steph stared back at the wan, thoughtful smile. And we'll fix your power switch. The robot continued to stare. But, Stephanie added, walking to the side of the bench, you're staying on the floor. I don't need you falling off the bench again. Stephanie lifted the robot and grunted from the effort, both from her overall extreme tiredness and her property's sheer weight. There you go, safe and sound. She let out a breath of air. Sweetie Belle, meanwhile, looked around the room from the floor, inspecting it entirely, then looked up at its owner again. It sat, then its tail began to brush the floor slowly, although without the pink and purple hair it once possessed. It made a loud scraping noise. Well, that's adorable. Unable to hold the urge back any longer, Stephanie yawned and began to leave. She stepped around Sweetie. You be good now, she called back to the bot. It hadn't moved at all, and maybe she couldn't turn it off, but there wasn't much else she could do. Without another 10 minutes of work to unhook things manually. Still, Stephanie took some precaution. Hey, Hal, she addressed the camera at the front of the stairs, which blinked on. Let me know if something goes wrong, okay? If you have to, force her to shut down the computer. For now, just record what she does. If your project does misbehave, should I wake you up, Stephanie? Hal responded. The machine recalled that it had been told the same thing for other projects, and it had every and it had every instance of its notifications being ignored, carefully archived. So it clarified what exactly its owner wanted it to do. Stephanie yawned again and spoke through the middle of it. Yeah. Yeah. Only if it's dangerous or she breaks something, including herself. And while you're at it, excuse me, the yawns were fighting to put her to sleep right there on her feet. While you're at it, run another diagnostic, making maybe something will turn up. I could kill Sweetie's power directly, but I'm worried it might cause damage. Certainly, Stephanie. The sound of the computers beginning just that began, and Hal began reinspecting Stephanie's old creation. Thank you. Night, Hal. Stephanie half-heartedly waved a hand and trudged up the stairs. She was so tired she thought she could actually hear her bed calling her. It didn't escape Stephanie that she sometimes spoke to her machines as though they were people. The habit had just grown over the years. All of them were rather uncanny in their responses, generated randomly, scripted or not. She had outdone herself tinkering with each new toy. They didn't compare so much to the accomplishments that had begun to storm the market in recent years. It was 2023 after all. Still, they made her happy, and if Sweetie was lost, that would be a blow to Steph. Once Stephanie had carefully climbed the stairs, she shut the door to the basement. After a thought, she locked it too. I don't get it. She stood there, frowning slightly at the door. Sweetie's hardware, power cells, nearly everything checked out. How was her behavior such a mess when her programming looks fine? The fact that the diagnostics had revealed very little outwardly wrong with the bot was strange. Stranger than that was Stephanie hadn't been able to find what could even be causing the unexplainable phenomena with Sweetie. It was like something was controlling her. Stephanie let that thought hang as she walked back to her room. Could Hal or GLaDOS be playing a trick? She knew they couldn't be, not really. Maybe it was possible, but their jokes shouldn't go past being verbal or snarky. Then again, they both surprised her every now and then too. The charred smell from Sweetie's room tickled her nose unpleasantly as she walked past. Stephanie groaned in dismay. And I'm gonna dang it. I'm gonna have to get to fix that too. Her eyes caught the as she half stumbled into her room. It was nearly 8 in the morning. At least her batteries weren't ruined. After another yawn, she cracked her jaw. The tired inventor had energy, and though left for one. Final word as she collapsed full onto the bed. Sleep! Stephanie's head slammed into the pillow with a loud poof, and was out like a light immediately.
Later that afternoon, Saturday.
Stephanie groaned and rolled over, pulling a pillow over her head to shut out the screeching voice of the thing she had used as a scarily effective alarm clock. The core bounced on the gantry arm happily. At least it gave the impression of being happy with its recorded message. Stephanie growled and pulled up the pillow around her head tighter, pushing herself into the corner between the wall and the mattress in a feeble attempt to hide from the ear-piercing noise being projected at her. She waved one hand in its vague direction as a final bid to discourage the attack being committed on her person. Undeterred, the yellow core's eye circled and bobbed randomly in increasingly enthusiastic ways as it rambled about space. GLaDOS lowered the core down closer to its owner's ear. Suddenly, it stopped. The room was quiet for just a moment until the core whispered, Stephanie braced herself. Groaning, rolling over, and slapping both hands to her face at once, Stephanie admitted defeat. All right, I'm getting up. Getting up now. You can turn him off, she begged GLaDOS, waving an arm in a circle as a frantic gesture. Tiredness kept her from getting up right away, so she laid back on the pillow to stare up at the ceiling. GLaDOS extended her form over Steph's head, still holding Space Core in one robotic arm. As much as I would like to, which I wouldn't. What would that accomplish? Simply put, you need to get out of bed before I can deactivate it, Stephanie. The core continued to spin its eye randomly while spouting words in the painful tone of voice it used. Go to space, comet stars, galaxies, Orion. GLaDOS continued over it. I realize it must be difficult for someone as large as you to climb out of bed, but do try. Stephanie coughed out some laughter and sat up and rolled out of bed, pushing the invasive GLaDOS and Space Core aside as she did. As if on command, the two wheeled out of the room. Space Core now silent. It had been important for Stephanie to get up when she did. They would just get worse if she tried to ignore them. That's how she had them programmed. They were very effective alarm clocks, considering her persistence to sleep in if she could. Even if she would regret sleeping so much later, she needed the extra bit of help rising. Stephanie inhaled deeply, stretching this way and that in order to wake up. Her eyes still stuck closed, as though refusing to let her try and be awake to begin with. After being conscious for nearly 24 hours the day before, the mere 8 hours rest felt insufficient to her. She felt she could fall back asleep, and for another 8 hours too. Now that she had dispatched the two robot team, but there was a lot that needed to be done. After a quick shower, a disorderly breakfast courtesy of GLaDOS, and getting dressed in a fresh pair of jeans and a shirt more suited for work, Stephanie began her day. So, what's first? Stephanie unlocked the basement door and stepped into the basement. It would be a mess, she recalled, from the scattered broken lighting and late-night robot tinkering she had done. Ignoring that for now, she addressed Hal. Hey, wake up! I cannot wake up. I do not sleep, the machine mind replied dryly to her with the reminder, without so much as saying hello first. Stephanie thought, making her way down into the half-ruined lab. It was worse than she remembered it, though she had been less than observant last night. Once she reached the bottom of the stairs, she could see Sweetie Belle sitting on the floor beside the bench, two cords stringing out from her back, hooked up to the charger and computer respectively. Along with her were the half-destroyed lights and scattered spare parts around the room. Wow, I really did tear the place apart, didn't I? Hal continued speaking. Good morning, Stephanie. How did you sleep? Stephanie approached Sweetie, and with her refreshed mind already filled with thoughts and ideas of what to do. Fine, Hal. Did you see her? Did she do anything last night? You didn't wake me up, so I assume everything is fine. First thing she checked was Sweetie's power. Her new battery was fully charged as normal. Better than fine, so to speak, Hal replied. Stephanie unhooked Sweetie from the bench and slid into her work chair. Oh? She asked absently, then stopped and looked at one of Hal's cameras. What do you mean by that? Hal drawled on the same drab tone he always used, but with a slight lightening of the last word he spoke. I merely mean to say, Stephanie, that since last night things were improved. You asked that I notify if anything should go wrong, but nothing did. It repeated what its orders had been, seeking clarification. That is not to say things have not changed, however. The program running Hal called on historical instances of confusing dialogue prompts with designation Stephanie. It often noted that she would act as though Unit Hal had not fulfilled what it had been told. Quite often this made things confusing for it. Stephanie had been about to talk with Hal. Stephanie had been about to ask what Hal had meant, but was distracted by the familiar sound of little metallic hoofsteps. Something tugged on her pant legs of her jeans. Looking down, sure enough, Sweetie Belle had a mouthful of denim and was pulling with it, looking back up at her. She figured out how to walk? The moment Stephanie said the words, she knew everything about them was wrong. Learn? What am I saying? There's got to be something broken, but it didn't just fix itself. Hal, what did you do to get her working? She turned to regard the red camera, watching from a nearby wall. I took no action while you slept. I was merely an observer, Stephanie. Hal replied promptly. Stephanie pushed Sweetie Belle off her leg and stood up to stride over to the camera she was speaking to. All right, what changed last night then? Answer me that. Sweetie's walking now, when she couldn't take a step without tumbling forward like a slinky last night. What happened? A small girl's voice chimed into the room, breaking the seriousness of the atmosphere. Stephanie? The woman whirled around to face her pet creation. It took careful step after step towards her, looking down occasionally as if unsure of its own hoofsfalls. Hal, Stephanie spoke hesitantly. Hal responded flatly, "Yes, Stephanie." Sweetie Belle looked up again, almost grinning. "Stephanie?" It moved its mouth in a strange, exaggerated way. "Did you reactivate her voice?" Stephanie locked eyes with Sweetie and swallowed. The little filly sat at her feet and continued to smile broadly. Hal was quiet a moment before responding slowly, "No, I did not." And that, everybody, is Chapter 4. Next up, Chapter 5.